That would be how I'd set it up.
Sweet.
All right, should we get to work? Uh, we will, I think, have future webinars in which we can talk about some of the more geeky orchard design questions like that. Ben, thanks for the teaser. Um, but in the meantime, we wanted to get into part two of our Italy report out. Noah, are you going to be in charge of the slides again tonight?
Yeah, it can be. I was going to ask you how you wanted to do it.
Yeah,
Uh,
let's do that again, if
okay.
as
Give
long
me
as
a,
that's okay for you. And I know we do have a few different faces on the call from last week. You all should have received two emails this week, both of which had links to recordings from part one. But just for safe measure, I'll give a little bit of background and context for why we're hosting this webinar and kind of some of what we covered in part one. So this webinar is a part of an ongoing series of webinars that we're hosting starting about a year ago and fingers crossed running through 2026 and potentially into early 2027. Though that series is occurring under an organic market development grant that we received from the USDA. That project is largely geared towards the research and design in support of building out what would be the largest chestnut processing facility in the country, which would also be organic certified. But in addition to that, it includes technical support. So some of you have taken one-on-one calls with me to get some technical support and answer some questions, but it also includes these webinars and some future demonstration days and written reports. Um, and yeah, so this webinar today is part two of a series based on part of the research work that we did is actually um, getting in contact with a bunch of equipment manufacturers and processing facilities in Italy and going and spending some time with them in person. Italy being kind of it's the second largest exporter of chestnuts in the world, but they also specifically have a focus on manufacturing the equipment for these facilities in Italy, which then also gets exported around the world. So it felt like the best visit for us, given our interest in both fresh and dried products, which Italy is producing, and the equipment needed to make those products. Um, we went to Italy in November of 24, came back and started to digest a lot of that learning, some of which we covered in part one and some of which we'll cover today in part two. And then we're hit by the federal funding freeze. And so where we stand today is we're continuing to do some of this technical support work that's really covered by our time. And we're kind of slow rolling the more cash intensive parts of this project, like working with architects to design the facility and purchasing the equipment, which ideally would be taking place in the very near future here. As it stands today, 2 weeks later, we have no real updates on the likelihood of this grant continuing, other than that our Congresswoman purportedly reached out to the USDA and conveyed that this is a high priority project for our district. She is a Republican, so maybe that'll hold more weight, but we're still kind of just fingers crossed waiting to hear what the USDA and Department of Government Efficiency or any other stakeholders have to say about our grant. Any questions about all that before we get into the meat of today? Sorry, no.
no.
Cool. And for those of you who haven't been on one of these webinars, it's very open format. We have a slide deck here and we'll be talking through the content, but if you have a question, you want to drop it in the chat, Bug and Noah can speak up and we can get it answered in real time as is relevant. And we'll save some questions for the end for a Q&A. So to go a bit deeper than we went last week when we kind of shared some of our higher level learnings and a bit of an overview of our trip, today we wanted to first go through an overview of all the equipment manufacturers who we encountered in Italy, give some kind of high level report out on basically who they are and where they fit in the bigger equipment context for both chestnut processing and chestnut harvesting. And in there, we'll kind of sprinkle in some of our thinking about how that relates to our facility specifically. And then we'll go into a review of two of the processing facilities we visited. So we visited people building machines and then people using those machines to sell chestnuts. Um, Noah, we are seeing your WhatsApp, just so you know. Um, and uh, so we'll go into a review of two of those facilities, and then we'll finish out kind of looking back at the very cartoonish flow diagram that we shared last week and talking a little bit more about some of the decisions that we're starting to think about with regard to our facility. Again, all of this is really geared towards kind of informing domestic thinking on chestnut processing as it stands today. No one in the US, as far as we are aware, is moving more than about 200,000 pounds a year in throughput through a processing facility. And no one is trying to do all of the steps of the processing phase that we are trying to do. And beyond that, there's been a lot of chestnuts planted both in the Northeast and in the Midwest in the past 5 years. And so very soon we're going to be needing to process millions of pounds in this country. And so starting to think about which equipment manufacturers we might all want to work with or import from, I think is a pretty important next step. So with that, we're going to talk first about Nunziata. I think you can broadly think of this as a tour from south to north in Italy. So the first couple of topics or we're going to be talking about Naples in the south of Italy, then moving towards Rome and central Italy, and then into the Piemonte or the Piedmont region, kind of as you approach the Alps and France in the northwest of Italy. So Nunziata is the largest equipment manufacturer in southern Italy. Um, I would think of them as kind of the large scale upstart manufacturer versus Boema, who we'll talk about momentarily. They really are designing for quite a diverse array of foods, but chestnut is a very significant part of their business. Um, they really emphasize in their conversations with us that customization is a priority for them. They've kind of reassured us as many times as they could that whatever we need, they can build, and that they make every line fit to their specific customer needs, which is quite contrary to Boema's approach as kind of more the like status quo in the industry, which both have kind of communicated that in their own ways. That said, as kind of lean and customized as Nunziata is, it's also quite expensive by the standards of the US chestnut industry. Um, when we say in here 150 to $300,000 per line, a line in their parlance is like a calibration or sizing line is one unit of a whole processing facility, versus a sterilization line would be another unit, or a sorting and visual inspection line would be another. So for a facility of our scale, trying to move towards something like 1 million pounds a year, um, we would expect to spend at least $1 million on equipment if we were buying everything for our facility from Nunziata. Um, that said, they are demonstrating that their equipment works at a 15 million pound a year scale. We visited facilities that we're doing 9,000 pounds in an hour quite easily. So that would be, an over 100,000 pound a day um, type scale. And yeah, let's see. Other things we just wanted to highlight about Nunziata was, I think broadly their team seemed maybe a little less experienced in international export and communications, but they have someone on their team, Gennaro Russo, who's kind of outside consultant for them, who's really the customer facing English speaking side, who was really helpful and easy to communicate with and spent time in Albany for I think almost a decade. Um,
And
and
also as an
really,
import
what was
professional.
that?
And also as an import-export professional.
Yeah,
So I think,
beyond food. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then they do offer things like sending their engineers over with their equipment. They actually advocate for that. So it's not just like buy a piece of equipment and hope a container shows up and you know what to do with it. But this really is a partnership where they're installing it in your facility, they're training your employees. So it's quite a level of professionalism that is where I would expect our industry to go. But I'd say across our full facility is not quite the scale or cost that we're ready to take on as Breadtree. And then why don't we go through some of the remaining slides and we can add some more detail based on some of the images that we're showing relating to Nunziata's equipment. Um, I think the piece of equipment that stood out to us most about Nunziata is the sterilization line. We talked about this a bit last week, but um, there was actually a Michigan State study a number of years ago from their engineering department where they looked at treatment of brown rot and chestnut weevil and kind of looked at some of the standard treatments today, such as the hot water jacuzzi or the hot water bath that you're dunking bulk bins like this into. And that's really the solution that Italians were using until about 30 years ago when firms like Boema and Nunziata started designing this sterilization line. It's a much more integrated approach to processing where on the left here, you're actually seeing something called a swilling tank where the bad nuts are being floated and then as is shown on the right, they're diverted off of the surface of the water into bulk bins. Those bins are then going into a waste stream because those nuts are inedible. And then automatically, without a human intervening, this blue conveyor system is moving those nuts into a hot water tank that moves them at a set time duration through 120-degree water to sterilize them and kill chestnut weevil eggs. This unit that we're looking at here was about a $450,000 unit, doing about 9,000 pounds an hour. It's something that we'd love to see in more facilities in the US, and we're just not quite ready for it yet. To Nunziata's credit, they have come up with a custom design for us that's about a third of the scale of this and cuts the price in about half, which is something we just received a couple of weeks ago, the specs for that. And so we haven't really had the opportunity, given the grant funding freeze, to consider how that might fit into the future of our facility. But I think it is quite symbolic of their willingness to customize and at least attempt to create a solution that better fits the scale of the current US chestnut context. Um, Noah, anything you wanted to add in terms of what we're looking at regarding Nunziata here or Bug?
I think
Uh,
you might have already said this. I'm sorry, I was sending a quick email, but I think it's worth remembering that they actually used to build a lot small. All of these lines were a lot smaller in the past. So they actually have a lot of experience building much smaller equipment lines, and they've just scaled with the Italian chestnut industry. But like they have an old model of a much smaller sterilization line. Just think that's cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted
Thanks,
to make
Bug.
sure everybody was seeing the relationship between uh, these images and the image here. So the elevator that you see on the left here is leading up to where Vittorio is standing on top of that, and inside of that tank, which is kind of like shaped like a tanker truck, um, there's a big auger, like Russell said. You can see something that kind of looks like a PTO shaft in the lower left that's powering that. Yeah, exactly, like Russell's drawing. Um, so that's just how that works.
Thanks, Noah.
Um, Russ, you want me to move forward to the other photos we have?
Yeah, let's do that.
Here's a wider. This is actually a more demonstrative photo of another this is a facility that we're gonna cover in more detail later called Mastro Gregori outside of Rome, but this is a um like a different instance of the same basic system where you can see the progression a little more clearly.
And to describe this in a little more detail, so this forklift is carrying these gravity feed bins. We talked about this a little bit last week as well. one thing that's great about these bins is that you don't have to use the forklift to tilt them, like you have to do with open top bulk bins. And so they just place the bin here. There's a door that allows it to gravity feed down. So the nuts are just falling with gravity and then are conveying up this conveyor again, like Noah was just talking about, into this cylinder, progressing through here in the hot water bath, um, and then ending in a final swill tank to cool them back to room temperature, and then coming up this conveyor into a fan-based dryer. And so really you're cleaning the nuts, you're getting a first level of inspection by floating the nuts, you're sterilizing them, and then you're cooling them and drying them all within this quite compact unit, which was another helpful design to see. I think for us, one of the biggest challenges in that we're renovating an existing building is thinking about how to kind of allow enough space to continue to exist in our building while we're importing in equipment which is quite large and maybe not all that mobile. So seeing different layouts of the same processing line in different contexts was quite helpful. And then this is just another example of some of the calibration machines or sizing lines that Boema creates. They can be graded down to the millimeter for more specific processing use cases, like using a flame peeler. Not super relevant to the approach that we're taking at Bread Tree because we're not intending to peel wet nuts, only shell dried nuts. But this was an example, again, where the bins are sitting on recessed scales. So each of these bins is on a scale, and as it fills to the desired weight, it then shuts off the release from the calibrator so that you're not overfilling those bins. And then a forklift can come along at its own desired rhythm by the operator and pick up those bins and move them on to the next phase here. Noah and Bug, anything you wanted to add about the calibration lines we're seeing here? Great.
I think just one thing to add, since I, I'm sure we talked about this in like in passing in the previous webinar, but I just want to point out to folks that the calibration in this flow is happening before sterilization. So basically on the right in this image is intake arriving, and where you see like some yellow curbs, there's actually a recessed hopper that's, like a dump truck sized recessed hopper receiving arrivals that are then being processed through like the machines that you see that have ducts attached to them are different kinds of aspirators that are basically that they're separating non-chestnut material from chestnuts, by aspirating lighter material and then using water to sink out stones and other heavier material. And then they're going into calibration. So basically, by the time any chestnuts are arriving um, at the whole hot water sterilization complex that we were discussing for like the last 5 minutes or so, they are already batched by size, uh, which is just, I think, an important thing to observe because that's different than, for example, what Route 9 Cooperative in Ohio does, which is actually to aspirate hot water bath and then calibrate and sort, which calibrate is like sort by size in Italian.
I saw a question in the chat about specific products coming out of each facility. We've kind of shown two different facilities in through these images, both of which are using Nunziata equipment. The first one we were showing, or the second one we were showing, that's kind of the horseshoe shaped line. That is a fresh only line. Um,
This,
so that facility is only producing wet products. So that might be whole fresh nuts in mesh bags. That also could be, in some contexts, that would also be peeled nuts that then get boiled after the fact. But they're not doing, for example, any drying of the nuts and shelling and milling into flour or selling as dried kernels. Um, the image Noah was just showing from the calibration facility, they're only really processing whole nuts, and then they're sending to a neighboring facility where they're then doing substantially more processing. In particular, the neighboring facility is using the flame peeler, which is basically a conveyor belt with a bunch of giant flamethrowers that are calibrated to only burn the shell and pellicle off the nuts and then leave you with a whole nut meat that's effectively fresh. And then that gets steamed or to basically create a parboiled fresh nut that then gets bagged. So this facility specifically is just sizing, sterilizing, and then visually inspecting on conveyor belts. But its a budding facility is then processing so that they can go to market either with fresh or steamed nuts. Um, just to fill in a little more here, there's some questions from Liang. Is this happening continuously throughout the year or just during harvest season? So all of the facilities we've shown so far are doing both import and export. So they're not just processing for Italian chestnut producers. For example, both of these facilities are receiving from Chile. So they start receiving nuts, I believe, in June, and then somewhat continuously are receiving nuts through November, December. So from Chile, but also Albania, Turkey, Greece, Spain, Portugal. And so it is somewhat continuously, but I would say from what I understood, it was more like June is a peak, and then it's a little slower in July and August. And then as September and October come in and you have more of the European production, then it ramps back up. Um, so I wouldn't say it's 15 million pounds spread evenly across all of the months, but I would guess it's spread somewhat evenly across like 6 months into December, January. The sterilization solution is just 120-degree water. They are not adding any bleach or Sanidate products or peroxide. That definitely varies in the US. Some, and Bug and Noah, you can probably speak in more detail to this, but Route 9, for example, is using, is it bleach in their hot water bath?
Yeah. Um, Clorox is their preferred bleach.
Yeah. Um, so that also is going to depend on if you're an organic facility or not. But for the most part, organic standards, well, actually, don't quote me on this, but if you want to look at organic standards for peroxide or bleach, you can look that up online in terms of the NOP product list. I believe the organic standard for peroxide is actually the same ratio as the FDA standards. Um, so basically, if it's considered food safe, it's also organic. But don't quote me on that. I would double check. And then any idea what happens to waste stream, animal feed, compost? Is it around 10% of total volume? Uh, I'd say it depends on the facility and how they're processing. So, for example, the facility where they're doing the brulage, where they're removing all pellicles and shells using the flame peeler, um, we saw dump trucks backing up to a giant pile of kind of ashen shells that were just being scooped with a front loader into a dump truck, and it was like many, many tons of burnt shells being trucked away. I assume they're just going to someone's compost pile, maybe being mixed with bed pack or something at a livestock facility. Um, in terms of kind of cold nuts, we didn't really see anyone doing any kind of particularly creative use with them. I think at like a homestead scale or in kind of the more rural context, there was some discussion of them as an animal feed, which is definitely an option. Um, and I would say the numbers we heard ranged from 10 to 20% in terms of total material that was being culled. All right, so this is a facility that we haven't looked at yet, but it's another one of Nunziata's customers. Um, This facility was interesting to us in that it was one of the newer builds, and I think we may have another angle of this setup as well. I'm not sure, but I think one of the most striking things about it was the facility was quite oversized for the specific processing line, and that actually seemed to be really useful there was kind of just stuff all over, and it seemed like the flexibility of that facility was quite convenient. Um, it I don't, the only other takeaway I really had from this facility was that it didn't seem like this unit, which is, um, I believe is this boiling them, Noah and Bug? Do you remember?
I can only remember that this
I
place
thought this
is
was steam peeling them, but it seems
Yeah,
like they're coming right out of the brewage because that was
yeah.
right.
So
So it wouldn't, yeah.
yeah, so this was brewage is off to the left of the screen. You're right, and then it was coming in on a conveyor, steam cooking, and then they were going through a flash freezer,
yeah, they were
which
flash
is
frozen.
they were being flash frozen over here and flowing this way. Um, And I thought one of the interesting things, and I don't know what this says about the facility versus the equipment manufacturer, but there was a lot of overflow and cleanup. Like there was just like nuts falling out of the processing line and being like mopped up off the floor. There was a lot of water not quite getting to the drains, like the recessed drains. Um, so this isn't a line that we're particularly interested in. We're really trying to focus on fresh whole nuts and then dried products. But that was one of my takeaways from looking at this line is that it just seemed like there was quite a bit of slop or margin of error in how it was being utilized. Um,
Ross, that's the end
from
of the pictures we have for Nunziata. Is there anything else that, before I go to Anatrini, is there anything else that you want to discuss on this?
um, Not from my end. I think this kind of captures the scale at which Nunziata is working. I think for me, as someone who doesn't have all that much experience in food processing, one of my big takeaways on the trip was kind of seeing the difference between someone who's kind of more of this multi-million pound, very uh, equipment intensive approach versus some of the more kind of like farm scale equipment that we'll get into later in this presentation. Anything either of you wanted to add about Nunziata before we move on?
I just wanted to make a note that maybe we'll be able to send some video links out in the recording that help people actually see like the whole line of how something moves from when the nut is like coming into the facility through the whole process, just because it would be helpful for my brain, I think, to get to see that.
Yeah.
All right. So the next folks we want to talk about is Anatrini. We unfortunately were not able to get in direct contact with them. We couldn't get them to reply. We are thinking because we're interested in some of their units that we might do a second round of follow-up with some of the contexts we established in person, and see if other folks would be able to help us hear back from them. But Anatrini, by all accounts, is quite comparable to Nunziata. They're kind of what Nunziata is to Naples and the south of Rome. Anatrini seems to be to central or the south of Italy. Anatrini seems to be to central Italy, around Rome, kind of the go-to larger scale equipment fabricator and manufacturer. Um, as we go through some of the images later, you'll notice a number of blue units, blue and white units. Those tend to be the Anatrini, though Nunziata does occasionally use blue and white as well. The major piece of equipment that I think we're aware of that may distinguish Anatrini, um, and no, I'm not sure. Did you include an image of the sheller in here?
I don't have it in here,
Okay.
but for the folks who were in the webinar a couple weeks ago, we had some discussion. I think John O'Niger was asking about shellers for um, dried chestnuts, and I discussed in some detail our efforts to find something that perfectly met our needs, and basically said I didn't think we had found something perfect yet. And today when I was putting together these photos, I looked back at on Trini's website and realized that they actually make something that probably is a great solution for shelling dried chestnuts prior to milling or fragmentation into other dried products. And so we'll just have to find a way to get back in touch with them. But that is something that we haven't been able, we've only found that specific sheller of dried chestnuts in a PTO powered format or from manufacturers who won't export to the States prior to
And
realizing that Onitrini does it.
maybe it's just helpful to clarify too, since we've been talking about that unit quite a bit. Um, I'm not does it, well, I'm going to assume not everyone on the call actually understands the difference between peeling and shelling in this context, or wet peeling and dry shelling. So, if you have not dried a chestnut, the kernel, the nut meat, is quite tight to the pellicle, which is the skin around the nut meat, and the shell itself. So in that context, if I apply force to the shell when it's still wet, at best, I am going to fracture the shell, but probably the kernel is not actually going to that effectively separate from the shell or the pellicle. So I'm just damaging a fresh nut, but not effectively removing the shell. And so for anyone who's trying to sell these products that are like, if you've ever seen in a US grocery store a vacuum sealed bag that has cooked nuts in it with no shell on it, the way they're doing that is either this kind of flame peeling, so where a fresh nut is exposed to the right amount of flame that it just burns the shell off, but doesn't damage the kernel, or they're putting it through a machine that scores it. So it puts a slice through the shell and then exposes it to boiling water or steam, which or roasting in a convection oven, which then forces that kind of to further split open, and then the shell can be mechanically removed. Um, or they're doing some combination of all of those steps with like a scoring and a blanching and then a shell removal more manually. All of that is only really if you want to be selling a wet nut meat and undried nut meat um, without a shell on it. We personally don't find that to be that compelling of a product because it's something that's already so readily imported to the US at a quite reasonable price point. It's also, in my opinion, just not all that tasty of a product, and I think is a little harder to sell, especially to consumers in the US who, for the most part, are not all that familiar with chestnuts. So when Noah's talking about what's been hard for us to find, it's that when you start to dry a chestnut, which would be done in large silo dryers at a low temperature, the nut meat actually recedes from the skin that's wrapped around it and from the shell. And so then you end up more like a rattle. So you have like a shell with a nut meat rattling around inside of it, and the shell actually becomes more brittle in that drying process. And so then what you can do is create force on that shell in one way or another. That can be as simple as kind of a grinding mechanism that the shell is rolling through, or some kind of vacuum or pneumatic force that's forcing the nut to fly into a surface that it's impacting. But anyway, you fracture that shell and then apply forceful air to it, you blow the shell and the pellicle away from the kernel, and then you are left with a bunch of whole dried kernels that you can then process in a mill. So that second type of processing is what we are looking for, and Anna Trini is maybe a lead that we have on finding one. Aside from that, we've struggled to find something that meets our needs in terms of price point and throughput. So we have a few more examples of just some of the equipment that we did see in person from Anatrini. Again, it's quite similar to what we saw from Nunziata, and we really didn't hear anything from any of these processing facilities that indicated any meaningful difference in quality. This is a vertical elevator in blue that's sending the nuts up to an aspiration unit where they're being cleaned. So nuts are being dropped in this bin here and then are flowing up a vertical elevator into this unit, all of which is being produced by Anatrini. And then Noah, if you want to just flip to the next image. Here's a calibration setup also being constructed by Anatrini, quite similar to what we saw from Nunziata, also quite similar to what we see in the future from Boema. Again, this seems to be more about regional specificity and working with your neighbor or your local resource. Aldo, who's pictured here from Mastro Gregori, didn't really have anything particularly meaningful to say, distinguishing one of these manufacturers from the other in his experience. In our experience, Nunziata has been much easier to reach, so that makes them quite a bit more interesting to work with at this point. And then here's, again, another more fine-tuned calibration with these numbers all representing millimeter distinctions in the size of the nuts being sized here. Okay, so then next we wanted to talk about Boema. Boema really is kind of the market leader. I think they've been producing Chestnut equipment for like over 50 years. I would say their prices in general, as compared to Nunziata, are like 20 to 30% higher. I will say that they seem much more used to working with international clients. Their English fluency was a lot higher, just kind of as an organization, their ability to communicate. But they also were quite frank with us that we're just a tiny customer to them. They don't really have any interest in downsizing their lines. So, if Nunziata would be a $1 million plus line, this would be a $1.5 to $2 million line. It seems like chestnuts are kind of a decreasingly important portion of their portfolio, and they're kind of putting less and less into innovating on the chestnut processing lines. Our contact there was sharing with us and really focusing on even larger scale processing, things like canned vegetables and processed and bottled jams at, like a multinational CPG scale. So I'd say everything they're doing seems quite impressive, but expensive and not really ready to customize makes them not that great a fit for the US chestnut industry. This image here is showing that brulage machine, what we were referring to as a flamethrower with conveyor belts. One interesting anecdote from our experience is this was one of our last visits that we did of the trip. The very first visit we did, we got to visit a processing facility and walk past a brulage machine and be in the room that basically felt like you were in Mordor for 10 minutes. For those of you who've seen Lord of the Rings, it was just kind of like ash and flame everywhere, and we had no PPE on and just kind of like hair nets. And we were sitting at Boema's very clean facility a couple of weeks later, and the guy who designs these machines says, "Not to worry, they're very safe. We tell all of our customers that only one operator should ever be in the room with these machines, and no one else should go in there." So it was nice to hear that after the fact. It made me no less certain that Boema is producing top of the line equipment, but it did give us a little bit of context that some of their customers may not be operating that equipment up to specs. The other thing that was interesting is Boema was really the first customer or processor to say two things to us. One, they said, we're not even, everyone else insisted they were the best, that we would never find anything better than them, et cetera, et cetera. Boema kind of said, listen, guys, you can see how big this building is that you're sitting in. I don't think we need to tell you how successful we are or how many of these machines we've sold. I think our work speaks for itself. If you have questions about it, we'll answer those questions, but we're not going to tell you, we're not going to tell you the 10 reasons why we're better than everyone else, which was just kind of a funny, different tact. But they also then really highlighted that a number of these pieces of equipment, and we'll talk about this a bit later as we talk about some of the thinking we're doing about how do we onshore some of this equipment manufacturing. is that frankly, a lot of the equipment we're interested in is just quite simple machines, and that paying a lot of money to import steel across an ocean when it's just being turned into machines that US fabricators could be making here, um, is maybe not the best process to take, especially as we think about a growing industry in the US. So it was just helpful to have them be quite frank about that, when they could have been, overselling on what they could deliver. But it was clear we weren't that important of a sale to them, and they were just interested in giving us some guidance. No and Bug, anything you want to add about Boema? Yeah, here's Mordor. And feel free to drop any questions in the chat, if you have any questions on what we've covered so far with Nunziata, Anatrini, and Boema.
I
Noah, do you
noticed that
want
when
to? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just noticed that when you were talking about Mordor, you said if anyone in the webinar has seen Lord of the Rings, and it's possible that some people in the webinar have actually been to Mordor.
That was a really good point. Thank you. Bug, thanks for coming off mute to share that giggle with us.
I needed to. I was actually gonna say those guys were they actually every brewage station was run by like an extremely grizzled old man wearing like all black, like thick leather.
These are just some other images of the Chestnut line um, from Boema. I think my general impression with Boema was like it was like the craftsmanship of what they were doing was really exquisite, and um, there was a kind of like we didn't see anyone who were producing at a level of quality that I didn't think was great. Like I think generally the fabrication industry in Italy like operates at a really high standard, and that's why like you know we say the Ferrari of its category, like why Lamborghinis and uh, Ferraris are made in Italy, but Boema was really excellent by even excellent standards. And it should be because they're the biggest player and kind of the industry incumbent and charge more than everybody else. And as Russell said, it didn't seem super relevant to the US chestnut industry for probably at least 25 years. So it's kind of like for what it's worth. There's a big sterilization line from Poema.
Also, I think just to give folks some context, for those of you who haven't been in the chestnut conversation for a decade or so, part of what was helpful for us is just, um, so much in our relatively young chestnut industry is like the advice you get based on one person's experience. And so, like, there's a handful of people who have worked with FACMA, for example, who we'll talk about here. And they might say, well, the FACMA harvester is great. And there might be one person harvesting chestnuts with a Monchiero harvester, and they'll say, the Monchiero harvester is great. And one person who bought one piece of equipment from Boema 30 years ago, and they say, Boema is great. And I think part of what we're trying to do with this study is, uh, it's all well and good to know that one person's happy with one piece of equipment they bought, but without contextualizing that in kind of the broader palette of everything that is available in the world, it's quite hard to actually make these important decisions for the future of our industry, whether that's at our facility scale or as we kind of come together in, um, a regional or national level. I think starting to have a little more discernment about like FACMA's great, and for example, maybe FACMA is the ideal set of processing equipment for facilities serving 20 to 50 acres, but not for facilities serving 1,000 acres. and starting to have this kind of pattern language of who's the right fit for what context, no matter where you are in the country or the continent, since we do have some Canadian friends here as well. Um, Noah, do you want to talk a little bit about FACMA, or should I keep going in the same rhythm we're in?
I'm muted. I can give you a break if you'd like.
Sure.
So Um, talking FACMA, we are shifting focus from firms that are primarily fabricating post-harvest processing equipment to now firms whose primary business is fabricating harvest equipment and also fabricate post-harvest equipment, but it's more like a 50-50 part of their business or like a lesser part of their business than harvest equipment. Specifically, the two firms that are in that category we're going to talk about are Fakma and Kyankya, and I guess Monquero to a lesser extent. And for all three of those firms, the post-harvest equipment that they produce is more targeted at a large farm scale or a small industrial scale. So like the biggest stuff that they make is smaller than the smallest stuff that the three firms Russell just covered make. Um, so it's just important kind of understanding of the categories we're dealing with here. So FACMA is a multi-generational family business, as are most of these firms that we've covered. Are most of them are family businesses. They're in the Viterbo region, which is outside of Rome, and I think are like the most well-known and best regarded manufacturer of chestnut and hazelnut harvesting equipment in that region. They do a lot of hazel-related equipment as well as chestnuts. In my perception, they're the most well known uh, for like ground harvesting of these firms among people I've talked to in the U.S. Like, uh, I had never heard anyone in the U.S. besides the one dude whose name I can't remember, Russ, who has a Monquero ever refer to anything other than a FACMA. Like FACMA has been referred to as kind of like the Kleenex of these kinds of mechanical harvesters in the conversations I've had with people in the US. Um, so FACMA's doing all their design and construction like soup to nuts in-house, which is pretty impressive and unique. And I think it's important to note it also does not mean that what they do is the result is necessarily better than some of their competitors who aren't doing it with that process. It just changes their relationship with those different phases and has some implications for the results. Um, their family owns and operates a pretty large hazelnut farm, like a multi-hundred hectare hazelnut farm. Um, and we thought that their experience and perspective as farmers was clearly informing their fabrication and iteration of machine designs over time, over the many decades that I think they've been in business since like the late 50s, if I remember correctly. Um, and they speak totally workable English. Like we were meeting with them in English, and I wasn't doing that much translation. So we have some photos here on the right. We're going to just show you some photos of their whole fabrication space, and then also the some of the machines they make. This is the uncle, the sort of like current patriarch of the family who invented a lot of this stuff and was just like an incredible character. Um, and you can see if you look carefully in these photos, like a lot of raw material, right? Like a lot of these pallet racks next to Michela are, square pipe, and here you see uh, like sheet goods and gauged, different gauge materials, different wire, different kind of pipe stock, and Um, they're just showing you like they're really making everything from scratch here in this facility. And an interesting thing, just kind of sociologically interesting that they noted is one of the reasons that they do everything in-house is because the region that they're in Viterbo, which is like a rural mountainous region east of Rome, doesn't have nearly as much industrial development as some of the area in Piemonte in the north, where some of their competitors are based in general in Italy. Like the south has been economically depressed and is more rural, and the north is has industrialized earlier, like kind of similar, analogous, I should say, to the States. Um, and so they don't have the choice of outsourcing a bunch of phases of their fabrication to neighbors because they don't have five top-notch fabrication shops like down the road. Whereas we're going to see later, firm like Monchero basically like designs all their parts, subcontracts all of the fabrication of those parts, and then assembles the parts in-house so that they're actually like allowing for greater specialization on each phase of that than they could even achieve in their own house. Um,
I think that
this, go
Go
ahead,
ahead, just
sorry.
add. I think another important factor there, and I mean, it's even shown in that this image you were just on with the hammers, is that I think that's obviously true. And what felt so overwhelming in talking with them is how much their experience farming is driving their design process. I think maybe more so than anyone else. We've actually definitely more so than any other equipment company that we visited. They were offering us all sorts of, I mean, this right here, they've designed multiple styles of flail hammers. So basically, like flail blades, but more designed as a hammer so that it's actually grading the ground. It's like a heavy duty enough blade to actually change the shape of the ground so that it's easier to ground harvest on because you're basically filling in your divots, but with your mowing system. Um, and just the number of nuanced design details that the fellow that Noah showed moments ago, he and his brother, I believe, have come up with, and since the newer generation has taken on. I mean, Michaela, who's their niece, could speak in such great detail. She's really the salesperson and representative today, but she could speak in such great detail to all of the decision making that went into kind of the machines that we can now shop for today. And I just thought that was like a really important part of the character of this place is it was farmer driven design from a multi-hundred hectare hazelnut operation where we actually got to visit and stand in, within, I don't know, a couple hundred hectares of hazels that they're managing. Also, interestingly, something that struck us as we were talking to them about hazels and when they move into certain management types after planting hazels and asking about how that would impact our young chestnut orchards, their response was, "Oh, we've never had to plant a chestnut tree," which was just quite a stark reminder of the culture in which they exist. They harvest from chestnut trees, but they don't plant them, which was, yeah, super helpful to hear. Sorry, no, go ahead.
Very different. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I thought that was amazing to hear. We asked them, they like all had to chatter among themselves, and then she was like, none of us have ever planted a chestnut tree. Um, so this is the rotors from the inside of these mulching units, which we showed actually in the previous webinar. And this is what they recommend for improving harvest conditions and breaking up any kind of woody debris from prunings or other, windfall in the orchard to make a nice, clean harvest surface prior to harvest. Um, Here's another kind of wide shot from the interior of their factory. Um, these are some photos that we showed in the previous webinar, but this is a whole intake, aspiration, and shelling system for hazelnuts at their hazelnut farm. And then on we're looking at two sides of the same wall, like you can use the windows and that fan unit as reference points. Um, the kernels from this intake unit and separation process are flowing into these silo dryers, which are drying out the hazelnuts and making them more shelf stable. So this is examples of some of their post-harvest equipment. The silo dryers on the right are very similar to grain bins that, are made for other purposes and other crops in the States, but um, this is like a pretty appealing scale from our perspective for a facility like the one that we are designing. It might not be exactly these units, but something in this kind of order of magnitude compared to like some of the some of the comparable units we've seen in like bigger facilities are just way, way too big. Um, and then we'll just show a couple examples of their harvest equipment. We also talked about this in the previous webinar, but this is a pull behind PTO powered vacuum harvester, which represents an example of their sort of smaller end of their scale for harvesters. And then here's Eric, who just joined the chat, and myself in their an example of their medium and large lines. Eric sitting in a self-propelled vacuum harvester, and I'm sitting in a self-propelled mechanical harvester. So the mechanical harvester is more expensive, bigger, has a larger capacity than the vacuum harvester, but that vacuum harvester is itself obviously self-propelled and bigger than the tow behind PTO powered vacuum harvester in the previous slide. Um, a big advantage of the mechanical harvesting is that you do not need to windrow the nuts before you harvest them, whereas the unit on the left requires that you windrow prior to harvest. Um, this is an example of a crazy trike tractor that uh, uncle designed. I think it's an 85 horsepower tricycle tractor. And they were just showing, I don't even think they produced this commercially, but they're just showing this to you're also, if you look in the background, you can see like we're deep in their hazelnut farm here. And they just showed us the mulcher that I showed a couple of slides ago running on this machine. And this is just an example of like the culture of this place, these dudes just like invented this for some reasons that I can't remember and, you know, messed around with it a bunch and ultimately decided that they didn't want to take it to market. But, um, that's the kind of play that they can do when they control uh, the whole production process from
Yeah.
beginning to end.
To show us how impressive this machine was, they stood us on the driveway and mowed a like 30% slope berm, which this vehicle was just driving alongside like this. And then they
Yeah.
cocked the mower out to the side. Um, and it was super impressive. I think we'd like to have one of these if we could.
Yeah. It's kind of like a Venn track, but
Yeah.
a bizarro Mad Max Venn track with more power.
I think in terms of a somewhat like summarizing point here, we're not sure where exactly we're going to end up on equipment, but I would say the direction we're generally moving is like a modified FACMA processing line, where we're kind of like taking as much as makes sense from FACMA's post-harvest processing and then layering in some solutions that are interesting for other reasons to us. So, like, for example, FACMA, because they're so focused on hazelnuts, is not producing any kind of sterilization line for weevil treatment. So if someone were to design a FACMA based processing facility, they'd either need to kind of stick with the current kind of status quo or conventional approach of hot water baths or import a sterilization line from a more expensive equipment manufacturer or domestically fabricate the sterilization line. So it's I'd say how we're generally thinking is like, what are the pieces from FACMA that work for us? And can we get some of those domestically fabricated, or do we need to import them? And where are FACMA's solutions not meeting our needs? And should we go elsewhere? Eric, since you're on the call, do you want to add any insights that you had from visiting FACMA? I'll put him on the spot. He probably just got off work.
He told me he was going to listen from the greenhouse, so he might have his hands
Oh, got
full.
it. All right. All right. Well, let's move on to Kyungkya.
Okay. Um, so Kyungkya, I think, does uh, there's a lot about what they make that's kind of like comparable with Fakma. Eric says he can't figure out how to unmute from a ladder. Okay, just be safe. Um, uh, so Kyungkya doesn't makes harvest equipment for chestnuts and hazelnuts, and they make post-harvest equipment for chestnuts and hazelnuts, again, kind of like at a large farm or small industrial scale. They don't make, um, how to say this, they make harvest equipment that is comparable and competitive with the smaller FACMA harvesting equipment. They do not make harvest equipment that is competitive with the larger FACMA harvest equipment. Um, and I think that is connected with the fact, as noted here, that they're relatively more focused on hazelnuts than chestnuts, which is like makes sense. If you go to Piemonte, there's hazelnut production like literally everywhere, um, in all the valley bottoms, like everywhere where you would see dairy, silage corn here, there's hazelnuts. Um, And yeah, they don't they do a lot of their own, parts fabrication. This is like a real factory that is doing a lot of fabrication, but they also buy in some parts of the process and some machines. Um, Something that's unique about Kyonkya among these firms we're discussing is that they already have an established relationship with a distributor in the States called BDI Machinery, a guy named Paul Licata. Um, and they have a large number of harvest units and other kind of post-harvest units already in use in the hazelnut industry in the Pacific Northwest. So there are a lot of Americans who already have kind of road tested some of these machines and have working experience with them and generally good reports. And they have kind of like an import-export process that's a lot more well developed or like less custom. It's like you speak with someone in the United States and they get you prices and they do all the import-export for you. We don't have as many good photos from the Kyankyo facility, but here are a few. Um, the I think these are all hazelnut machines. Um, this was a hazelnut husker, I believe, that
Yeah,
Eric
that's
is
right.
standing with Serena, who is the English-speaking daughter of Mario Chianca, who founded this firm. Um, who's a really bright guy. I just put in this image from their website today so that you all could get a sense of like the spectrum of what they make because we didn't take at this point we were tired and we had been doing this for a couple of weeks and we weren't quite as assiduous in our photography in this place, but um, they make a very wide range and some of these things you see here are like Serat mulchers are like made by other firms and they're just dealing with them because they're kind of like coherent with the rest of their system. Like you would use either a Serat mulcher or an Horizonte mulcher before you used one of their harvesters, so they don't make their own mulchers, that kind of thing, or a Meritano mulcher. But in any case, all the green and yellow stuff you see here, they make. Um, and it's quite diverse. And within these are not like, within each Seymour, there's a whole range of different machines at different sizes and with different focuses. So, their calibration was interesting to us for like farm scale, different farm scales in the States. Their drying was interesting to us. A lot of their conveyor belts and, their gravity bins, some of the cleaning units that they make, like aspiration units or stone separation units, because they're quite compact. They're usually on wheels, and they're like not too expensive. They're at a scale that I think is more accessible for you know, like a 50 to 100 acre operation in the States could really build a line out of these and have that make economic sense and make scale sense in terms of throughput. I think that's what I have for Kiankia.
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to add anything?
I think I would just add that just to give people a sense when we're saying like smaller scale, um, I would guess if you built like a full Kyonkyo line, you'd probably be buying like 100, maybe 80 to $150,000 of equipment,
Yeah.
versus the Nunziata line might be a million to 1.5 million, so roughly 10x the cost. Whereas I think a FACMA line, basically like the highest, the largest scale of a Kyonkyo line is significantly smaller than the largest scale of a FACMA line in that. And so I would think of it almost as like Kyonkyo is the smallest ready to order scale, and FACMA is like can also be close to that small, but goes quite a bit higher if you scale up in terms of the size of their units. Um,
Yeah.
and I would also just say that Kyonkya has pieces of equipment that they outsource or they buy from a third party and will sell you that FACMA maybe fabricates themselves. So I think FACMA is like a little more an all-in-one solution in terms of their fabrication, whereas Kyonkya is all-in-one, but you might be buying things that they're not actually making, which is not. I don't actually know if one of those is better or worse. I think it depends on your determination of their equipment and the solutions they're selling. But I would generally think of Kyonkya as a little bit smaller than FACMA in terms of the size and throughput of the solution.
Yeah, which I think it's important to understand their context and how their context kind of the analogy between their context and what we might hope to see develop in tree crops agroforestry industries in the Northeast in the next coming decades, because uh, they make a lot of this stuff at a you know f farm scale, which by the standards of these discussions is like a pretty big farms. Like there are many in the region that they're working in. There are many, many family farms that are like 20 to 80 hectare, like 10 to 80 hectare hazelnut operations that often have like older chestnut stands. Um, and they want to be able to do their own a bunch of their own processing on site so that when they bring their nuts, their hazels to Ferrero Rocher or whoever they're selling them to, they can get a higher rate for their weight, by being able to deliver a higher quality. And so they're making a lot of machines that kind of like are appropriately sized for farms of that scale, whereas FACMA is, I think, addressing the same market, but like in US terms, might be more like making machines that are appropriate for the scale of the facility that we're building, which is like 1 million to 2 million pounds of annual throughput, kind of like a regional aggregation processing facility. So I think like, for a lot of people on this call and people in this general community who are thinking about building their own, who either are already growing chestnuts or thinking about building their own chestnut farms, like this stuff that Kiankia makes is really purpose built to address the the like larger end of the scale of what a lot of farmers in the Northeast are interested in doing with chestnuts. And for that reason, I think it can play a really valuable role in the uh, kitting up of our industry in the region, even if it is in many cases like a little smaller than might be ideal for the facility that Breadtree is developing right now.
Um, no, I think I'll start chatting about Monkey Arrow, and I think we should try and move quickly through Monkey Arrow just so we have time to cover the rest of what we're trying to cover today and get into the Q&A.
Excellent.
Does that sound good? All right. So the last manufacturer in Italy that we wanted to talk about was Monchiero. They explicitly did not allow us to take images of their factory floor. So the only image we have is of me in the coveralls that they gifted us, which now are owned by Sam Bonney on our team. Um, this was far and away the most sophisticated manufacturing facility. They had robots take bringing parts to them on the floor. It was immaculately clean, like not a speck of dust in the whole place. Um, I would say Massimo Manchiero seems like the closest thing to like the Steve Jobs of Italian chestnut uh, equipment manufacturing. Um, they do already work extensively in the US, but almost entirely focused on their harvesting equipment, which is really what they are focused on as a business at this point is self-propelled harvesters. Um, and I think our takeaway was like it's kind of a no-brainer that their solution for chestnut harvesters at a certain scale, which I think is like I think at 100 mature acres, you'd be quite well justified to be spending something like $125,000 on their harvester for the efficiency it would add to your business. Um, if a 100-acre operation is harvesting somewhere between 100 and 200,000 pounds, I would easily pay for itself probably in a year of harvest efficiency. Um, so they're pretty available to talk. They invited us to visit with them when they're in the US, which they come to the US 2 or 3 times a year. They're already importing into the US. If you flip to the next slide, Noah, I think they felt like for the needs of that we have and that folks like us might have at like 100+ acre scale. I believe they advocated for the 2145, but we can definitely clarify that with them if anyone on this call is ready to go buy one of these. I think we're probably 5 to 10 years away from that ourselves. But basically, there's a bracket of harvester at which I think is like the 2145 and above that has substantially more slope stability. So in the context of Northeast chestnut agroforestry, that's going to be quite important in terms of maximizing the amount of land that you can access with the harvester. So that's both in terms of tires and the overall frame of the unit. Um, and then, yeah, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, just to give everyone a sense of like how these scales compare. Um, the smallest unit, like we showed that whole progression of the FACMA harvesters. The unit that you saw the photo of me sitting in, which was like the largest self-propelled mechanical harvester that FACMA makes, is directly competitive with the 2075 here that you see on the right, which is the smallest. So basically, the largest FACMA harvester is comparable to the smallest uh, Monkero harvester, and the second half of these number codes corresponds to the horsepower of the machine. So the 2075 is a 75 horsepower self-propelled unit, and the 2240 is a 240 horsepower self-propelled unit. So these are like comparable size, like that 240 is comparable size to like Midwest scale combine equipment, like the biggest, some of the bigger uh agricultural equipment that exists. It's very big.
And I think the other reason for the slope stability is I believe the 2115 and above has is articulating and has crab steering. So probably most folks might be familiar with a Ventrac as an articulating unit. It's more similar to that in how it moves across the landscape. Um, or so that's the other thing that was highlighted to us. Also, I believe the engine is located under the body in the 2115 and above, or on the underside of the unit. So kind of giving it a lower center of gravity. So those were some of the things that were highlighted. If you're interested in any of these, I'd say just reach out to us and we can put you in contact with them. They can speak in really great detail, and I would say we're like pretty even keeled about how they were selling us. They weren't just saying buy the biggest thing. They were listening to our needs and advocating for where they thought we'd end up in the long term. And then they do have a few different processing pieces of processing equipment, some of which we're actually quite interested in. But really, they say, like this is stuff we created, I don't know, 20 years ago when we were a smaller scale operation before we shifted to a focus on harvesting. We'll still fabricate it, but we don't keep any on the lot. It's basically like if you order it and pay for it, we'll build it and we know how to build it, but it's not something we're actively innovating on. It's not something that we have ready to go. Um, I think the on the left here we have basically something that is a competitor to the Kiankya and Fakma at non-self-propelled or PTO driven aspiration harvesters. So a vacuum that you tow behind a tractor. And then, but most interesting to us is the Pelletrice, which is that kind of dry shelling unit that we were talking about earlier. But this unit is, while quite kind of price competitive, it's I think around $11,000. It is PTO driven, and so you'd either need to run it off a tractor or set up an independent PTO unit in your facility to run it off of. Um, which is something you can do. It's just not the most elegant solution. So it's not like if we need to end up there, maybe we'll use this for a short time period and just use it outside, which I think could work even really up to like a 10 to 100,000 pound scale. But I think when you're talking about a million-pound scale facility, it probably would not work out that well. Um, I think let's jump ahead, Noah. I mean, this slide is really just capturing how global this business is, and that they're working across a number of crops, but really in particularly focused on hazelnuts as well as chestnuts. Um, so what we wanted to highlight here is we were kind of in this process of interviewing a number of domestic fabricators, as I said, when the federal grant freeze came down. We've slowed on that work because we don't even know that we'll have a budget to pursue these relationships. So it feels a little wasteful and disrespectful of everyone's time to get too far down those conversations. Um, what we've provided here is a list of some of the businesses domestically that we've been in contact with. Pendragon, for example, here has done work with probably some of the folks on this call. In terms of hazelnut processing, they were very excited to talk to us. We're looking forward to following up with them once we have more clarity on funding. And then there's a number of others that are in here that are either quite large scale, like serving tens or hundreds of thousands of acre California, mostly nut production. So that's like Grossi Fabrication and Wizard Manufacturing and Beeler Industries and Burrell. Burrell is also an international processor. Um, really, for those kinds of folks, we'd be making a pitch that's like, the chestnut industry is coming. Do you want to do this kind of R&D scale project with us and take the processing lines you're doing for walnut or almond or pecan and use some of that tech and fit it to our needs? Then there's this other class that's kind of like Savage Pecan Equipment and Thompson Industries that are more pecan focused, which kind of the nature of that industry is that it's a little smaller scale than almond or walnut, for example. And they seem like if the other folks I just mentioned are the Boemas and Nunziatas of US nut production, it seems to us like Savage and Thompson are more like the Kiankias and maybe the Fakmas of US nut production. So I think those are some promising leads. They've been there's been varying levels of interest from all of them. And then to Brennan's question here, so no one in the US makes a chestnut sterilization line, but all really a chestnut sterilization line is some water baths and some aspiration-based dryers attached to what is commonly in US food processing known as a rotary or screw blancher. So basically a giant stainless steel cylinder with a big screw moving your food product through water at a set temperature for a set duration. I had never heard of these before. It's not something I've ever thought of until talking about chestnuts, but apparently they're quite common. You know, all sorts of vegetables before they get canned go through screw blanchers. I think a lot of dry beans get processed through screw blanchers. Um, what was kind of fascinating to us is that I started trying to get quotes on screw blanchers from folks fabricating them. And basically, for what we're trying to do with chestnuts, we actually don't need as big of a unit as what Nunziata, for example, would make for us. Um, but hey, no, we're seeing your WhatsApp again, just so you know. Are you? Oh, that's intentional this time. Uh, you are muted if you're trying to talk over this, but I can talk over it too.
Yeah, I was trying to show people what a screw blancher,
Thanks.
what it really was.
Yeah. So,
So
in talking to some of the fabricators of screw blanchers, and Noah's just highlighting this part of the unit. Um, Basically, we could get a smaller unit than what we saw in Italy, but even if we did that and then had to add everything else onto it, the unit itself would probably cost us between two and $300,000 just for the screw blancher. Um, the folks we talked to made it clear that our needs were quite simple compared to a lot of the screw blanchers that they're building. And even though the controls are a pretty important part of the cost, we couldn't really get them to bring the cost down all that much, despite only needing a control that's set at a single temperature and just allowing us to change the time or the duration by a dial. So far we've had kind of an underwhelming set of responses in terms of the ability to onshore that unit. Basically, we could like buy everything Noah is showing here for the same price that a screw blancher would cost domestically, as far as we've found. The only other real option that we've spec'd a little bit is there is a pretty massive used market for screw blanchers. We definitely do not have the in-house capacity to buy a used unit and custom customize it for our needs. And so that's one of the reasons we were trying to start talking to machinists and fabricators in the US who might be able to help us think about how we would do that. Roughly speaking, it seems like we could probably buy a used unit for like between 30 and $60,000. So even if we needed to have a sizable contract to customize that on site, that seems like a more promising lead than buying a new unit. But I'd say as of right now, if we actually want to make an investment in this version of the sterilization approach, so far Nunziata's smaller line, which is smaller than what's showed here, is probably the best option we've found. So um, that doesn't mean we won't work with domestic fabricators. For example, calibration machines seem like a really easy place to start with domestic fabrication partnerships, as do aspiration cleaners, which is again like a pretty common piece of tech in basically cleaning any kind of recently harvested food product is using air to blow the lighter material off of it. So we are confident that over the next 6 months to a year, assuming this grant moves forward, we will identify some opportunities to work with domestic fabricators for certain pieces of equipment. But as it stands right now, we've just kind of been kind of courting partnerships. I did include Valley Chestnuts here, who's based in Iowa. I believe they maybe hit their peak processing last year in the like 10 to 20,000 pound range. I might be wrong about the exact number. I did talk to them on the phone, and they were super friendly and really interested in our project. And from what I've seen of what they've done online, I think they've done a really awesome scale processing for that, for the scale of what they're doing right now, which is aggregating from other growers and processing, like I said, 10 to 20,000 pounds. Um, but actually, I believe the man who's kind of the grandfather of the family who started the business and did a lot of the engineering work has since passed. So they were interested to hear about our project, but didn't feel like they had that much advice to give us to get started on right now. And that's kind of overview of where we're at on domestic fabricators. We'll definitely provide updates as this pursuit of finding some domestic partners gets further down the line. All right, so then we just wanted to give a couple overviews of two of the facilities we visited, and some of the takeaways we had from visiting them. The first one we'll look at, which we mentioned last week, is a totally women-run, two generation, though the grandfather, so a third generation started it, Fenolio Alberto. Um, I think they were interesting to us because they're really the most similar to what we're trying to accomplish. They have a quite nice grocery store and butcher shop on the front of the building. They're making chestnut flour, chestnut flour biscuits, chestnut flour pasta. They're also selling fresh nuts. They have about a 30,000 square foot facility, including the paved parking area and the market and cold storage, which is quite similar to where we might end up if you include our parking and kind of like the barnyard areas around our facility. And we had a admittedly kind of confusing conversation with them around numbers, but it seemed like they were maybe doing 4 million pounds or something like that a year. So more than twice as big as what we anticipate doing, and that they were producing about 2 million pounds of flour from that facility. Um, why don't we toggle over to the layout and we'll just talk a little bit about um, one of the things that I think was our biggest takeaway from this facility, and this graphic is intentionally convoluted. So part of what we're showing here is um, the purple is basically the flow of fresh chestnuts, and the blue is the flow of dried, shelled, and milled chestnuts. Um, and what was fascinating to us is how overlapping these flows are and how that actually seemed to be working in a quite orderly fashion on this site. Um, I think right now, when we're in a kind of our idealized stage of designing our facility, we're thinking about trying to make it as spacious as possible and have this really clean linear flow, and no one's ever backtracking and no forklifts ever crossing a human's path. And that definitely is what we're going to strive for. But this facility, I mean, we were there, I'd say, on the tail end of peak season, and pretty much no one was moving about the facility. There were people working in individual rooms. The only person moving kind of between different volumes or like following different arrows here was one man on a forklift. And he was a big man, but I don't think when you're on a forklift, it matters how big you are. Um, but he was pretty much just navigating this entire flow, picking up gravity feeding bins and kind of plastic bulk bins, moving bulk sacks of product between, I'll get my annotating cursor, between their drying unit and their cold storage. And then those would be moved over here to the milling section, or actually, oops, over here to the milling section, and then over here for packing. Um, and it just was a really helpful reminder that like when you're in architect mode, you can be thinking a lot in plan view in this aerial perspective and trying to make every arrow look perfect and every relationship ideal. And that actually in practice, like a lot of this is going to be done by one or two people, and it's going to be done at specific times of the year. And figuring out how certain spaces can be multi-use spaces and how, you can have this parking area be a receiving area in late September and early October, and it can move to a parking area for the market the rest of the year, and how kind of multi-use and overlapping use can be a really important part of design. And this site just kind of reinforced that for us. Um, no, I think you have a couple more images here. Bug and Noah, are there anything else you wanted to share about this facility? No.
This was an interesting architectural detail. These are showing two different, the two ends of this kind of like covered pass through. Um, so this was basically the space between the exterior space between two pre-existing older buildings that you see like in the red brick color that they had then built a roof over for this like covered pass through. You see that here, the middle, this, I don't know if my cursor is visible, but this middle area um, is that covered pass through. And we thought it was a really interesting kind of pattern architecturally for co-locating a lot of different machinery that uh, needed to be undercover but didn't really need to be inside with a lot of like loading and unloading, arrivals and departures type stuff. And it basically formed like a hallway off of which there were many rooms. But you never really went through, like maybe one room had the drying in it and another room had the shelling in it and another room had the milling in it. But you never really like went through a room to get to another room. You just went back to this hallway and went to another room, which was a kind of adaptive reuse solution, we thought.
Agreed. And then the last facility we wanted to show was you've probably you've now seen a number of images of this facility because of a lot of the equipment we've shown, but this is the biggest facility we visited, or kind of tied for biggest. It's about 100,000 square feet. It's Mastro Gregori. They are only processing fresh nuts there. They have an entirely separate site where they're processing dried nuts. They're doing about 15 million pounds throughput. Um, and One of the interesting things, or a couple of the interesting things I saw here, one is that um, that despite it being a huge facility, um, about let's say 25% of this facility is one large room, and nothing wet or dirty leaves that room. So all receiving, all cleaning, all aspiration, all sterilization, and all drying of recently sterilized nuts is happening in that room. And so what that means is even though nuts are entering the other volumes of the facility, it's kind of creating this kind of immaculate condition across the rest of this facility where packing's happening, where they have a really expensive optical sensor that they probably want to introduce as little mold and moisture to. Um, and I thought that was a really helpful thing to observe that can also be scaled down at a smaller facility. This facility I would say is quite counter to Fenoglio Alberto. It's a very recently built facility that is probably seems to be built based on learnings from their growing enterprise. So whereas Fenoglio Alberto has kind of layered on piece by piece, and that's resulting in a quite convoluted flow, that's kind of all built around this central core that's the original structure. This 100,000 square foot facility has all been built, I believe, in the past 10 to 15 years. Um, and it's just a lot more spacious, and the flow is much more linear. There's less doubling back over yourself. Um, Noah and Bug, anything you want to add before we just take a look at some of the pictures of this site?
Um, Nothing comes to my mind except that we did a side by side of flour that we got from a lot of different processors, including a couple of like people using traditional systems and firms like Mastro Gregori who were using all modern machines. And despite, I think, if any bias to disclose, a bias towards the more traditional ones, which were like very inspiring to visit and um, had really beautiful situations and family relationships and history associated with it. We really liked the flour that these people were making. And I don't think that I don't think that, I think there's like a non-accidental relationship between the way they were doing their processing and the results there. Everything is very clean.
Everything is very clean. So yeah, this is a 100,000 square foot facility, and I think we can click through the images quite quickly. But again, we're seeing receiving outdoor in a outdoor area, but that is covered. So having that kind of hybrid space. Moving in where we saw the Anna Trini receiving hopper and vertical elevator. Um, and this corridor for the forklift that's moving all these units is, I would say it was over 30 feet wide. I think the spec is generally like 12 to 15 feet is sufficient, but plenty of space to be kind of reorganizing bins, prioritizing certain batches based on the sizing coming out of this calibrator. Um, and then continuing on into the sterilization line that we showed earlier. Again, this being the kind of like messiest and wettest piece, and it's almost in its own peninsula, even within the processing floor. So set aside. Um, and then I think we have a few other pictures of where they were doing yeah, the digital imaging or the optical imaging, resizing here with the clean and cold stored chestnuts before they then go to the packing floor, where it was definitely the most densely populated part of the facility. I'd say there was maybe 10 people in this room, which was, a quarter of the size of the processing floor that had one or two people in it. And this is some of these are chestnuts going in mesh bags, in kind of packing crates. Some of it's going in 50-pound or 25-kilo burlap sacks. But this is the whole packing floor. And then here's an aerial view. So Fenolio Alberto, for comparison, again, was 36,000 square feet. Just to give you a sense, I believe our facility, including like all packing, will be, or sorry, including all parking and kind of outdoor and like vehicle and nut drop off, will be about that big. So they basically have a parking lot the size of our facility. Um, does have a solar install, just to give a sense of kind of what the flow was here. Oh, no, I had it already in there. Um, so nuts were being received here at the bottom of the screen, flowing through to the sterilization line that we've shown a few times, and then being staged at this dry curing area, which is still in that processing floor. And that was something we wanted to highlight here, is how much of the space of this facility is actually just kind of large rectangles where nuts are stored for days at a time. Um, so that's kind of either staging in ambient temperatures after they've come out of sterilization or recently been processed. And then also the cold storage unit on the northern end of the facility here. Um, so yeah, a very different flow than what we saw at Fenolio Alberto, really quite linear, quite spacious. Definitely kind of the optimal strategy if you can afford it. Our grant specifically requires us to work in an existing facility and not increase the square footage of that facility. So I think in the future we would advocate for people finding grant funding that doesn't limit them to doing that, but that is the boat that we are currently sailing in. We only have a few minutes left. Our intention was maybe to add some detail to this flow schematic from last week and talk a little bit about some of the decisions we're leaning towards, despite having finalized them. But I think given how little time we have left, it'd be good to have us stop talking and have some time for people to unmute and ask some questions.
So if
Any
the
questions?
yeah, if the funding continues to be held up, do you have thoughts about what you might do this season?
I think we would process similarly to what we did last year, which was a kind of like DIY home scale version of processing. So probably not make any significant investments in equipment for this season. But if I think we expect to be formulating a plan B over the next couple of months. We've been told we should hear any minute now about this grant and whether it is continuing. So once we have that news, I think we'll get the wheels turning on plan B. But I think our plan B, without a doubt, would be slower than our plan A was because we'd have a couple $1 million disappearing, which is not necessarily slower, is not necessarily worse. In some ways, we were kind of jumping the gun on getting started on this facility because we don't need it to be at this scale tomorrow. We really need it to be at this scale in like 2029, 2030. So we would just take a more DIY approach and also start to seek some alternative funding sources, maybe looking at private grants. Brandon's asking if there's a farm scale equipment for producing a shelled wet nut. Um, I am not sure. You would need to expose it. You basically have to expose it to some heat source. So you'd need to either be scoring and roasting, blanching, or boiling, or uh, flame creating your own brulage at a tiny scale. I think brulage is probably not going to be the answer. I do.
I think I
There
would
are.
look into blanchers, other like blanchers made for other
Yeah.
fruit and vegetables because some of you may have tried this. Like you can very easily blanch a chestnut at a home scale by just scoring it any way you like. Scoring it with a knife or a scissor or cracking the shell with a hammer and like putting in boiling water for a minute and then putting it in cold, like literally the same way you would blanch a tomato, like works excellent if you want to blanch a chestnut. It's just that that's not as easy a process to mechanize, is why they don't do it, in these big industrial scale facilities. But there might be like sort of like commercial kitchen scale blanchers for for restaurants, or like very small scale kind of jam preparation type thing. That was what comes to my mind. Because then you could also just get, there are small machines that do scoring. Um, some of these firms make small machines that do scoring, and the combination of those two would get you to what you're trying to do.
Thank you.
I've got a graph for the question that Matthew just shared. Let me find it.
You're gonna get the graph from last week.
Yeah, let me get it
Yeah.
open.
Yeah. Matt, on that question, I'd say our modeling is kind of best that we can come up with based on, a lot of anecdotal, hey, I'm planning on planting a couple acres here or 5 acres there. It's something we're always trying to get better data on in terms of who's planning to plant what. but Noah's going to put up an image in a second that shows yellow is what we're planning to be producing. Red is what we expect others in the Northeast to be producing, and blue is what we expect the region to be producing. So approaching 1 million pounds by 2035 is kind of where we see the region at. I would say I would be shocked if we were under 500,000 pounds by 2035 at this point. I mean, something really, really bad would have to happen,
And it's
which
important to note
I guess that is
something
very
really bad.
possible.
Yeah, it's on this topic, something pretty bad is probably happening, and that the climate smart commodities programs are definitely under threat, and those would have been paying for the establishment of a lot of trees. Um, but it's also just worth noting that this is modeling based on like very limited and conservative assumptions about what the ongoing new establishment would be during this time frame, right? So this is like mostly modeling projecting yields from farms that are either like established recently or we expect to be established in the next couple of years, and like some pretty conservative estimates. But if, you know, if you were to do a model like this where you were, let's say, just like linearly extrapolating from the last 5 years into the next 15 years of new orchard establishment, it would be way bigger numbers by 2040. And it's totally possible that even like a linear extrapolation would be conservative, and actually that the rate of establishment will increase over the next coming years. That to me seems likely. So. It, it, I think this is like probably conservative. Ooh, average producer size, I don't know. I think it's possible that average is not going to be that representative because like you'd have to come up with some kind of way to weight that average, right? Like there's definitely, we're aware of a decent handful of operations like in our network and community who are maybe not already established, but like are either like in the early phases of getting going or are talking about like a 50-acre scale, 50 to 100-acre scale, maybe a handful, Um, and there's a much larger number of people who are talking about like a 1 to 10 acre kind of scale. Um,
Yeah.
so I think what's going to determine that is like what are the rates of follow through that people can achieve on those goals across those different scales.
Yeah. I think right now we have roughly 50 people who either have planted chestnuts or are planning to in the next 3 years at like a commercial scale in our network. Um, and I think less than like I'd say like 5 to 8 of them might plant like 30 to 70 acres. And I would guess that about half of them will plant less than 10 acres. And then the remaining 30% or so would be like in the 10 to 25 acre range. Um, I think that's a very coarse analysis on the size. Alex is asking a question about the nut size range going through the Italian facilities. Um, it was pretty wide because basically it's everything from the smallest nut you've ever seen to the biggest nut you've ever seen. Uh, and but they have a lot of preference for nut size in fresh sales in Italy. Um, so I would say like nothing that would be classified as smaller than a large in the US would be sold fresh in Italy from what we saw, and maybe it might be only things that would be classified as extra large and larger would be sold as fresh. I'm not certain about that. Um, are there any considerations with regard to size for harvesting and processing? I think for us, the way we think about that consideration is basically that um, smalls we probably won't sell as fresh. So smalls are anything under 7/8 of an inch would be a small. And I think we will move towards all smalls or nuts that are under 3/4 of an inch will just flow into our drying line, which will end up being something like 10 to 20% of what we're harvesting probably. There are machines to score chestnuts. In general, if folks are looking for smaller scale equipment, a lot of what gets shared online is actually like Chinese manufactured units on Alibaba. So I'm sure there is like a Chinese scoring machine. Um, a lot of the folks that we were meeting with are more talking about like 20 plus acre scale operations. So it really, if you're like talking about scoring like tens of thousands of pounds, I think that would be the kinds of equipment that we were visiting. I think if you're talking about less than that for scoring, I would probably just Google it and look on Alibaba for what hits you get, and then decide what kind of risks you want to take in terms of how much that equipment's going to work.
Hey folks, I just had one last quick question. Thank you so much for summarizing all this information. I thought this was really useful, and I really appreciated like the level of depth you went to with your analysis. Um, at the beginning of the presentation, I think like at the one of the first slides, there was like a comment about like other products beyond chestnuts that were being considered. So maybe this is a question about like the bigger picture vision or sort of like a broader timeline, but sort of curious what the plan is to integrate those other product streams. And especially in regards to the processing equipment, like I think I saw a note on there about acorns, and I'm just not so sure if that equipment really exists on the market as like something that can be readily purchased. So yeah, just curious to hear more about like the thinking around those sort of things.
Yeah. Um, I'm happy to answer that, or Noah or Bug, if one of you wants to jump in. Happy to defer to you.
Um, so I think I'll try to answer. Well, there's a specific question there about acorn processing, and then a broader question about integrating like all non-chestnut process crop streams into the facility. Um, for acorns, Nadav, the places in the world where acorn flour production, well, like acorn has been industrialized are Spain, Portugal, and, or that I'm aware of, are Spain, Portugal, and South Korea. In South Korea, they have a traditional kind of like custard or pudding that is pretty commonly eaten there. That's made from like a, you could imagine like acorn flour being wet. It forms like a custard. In Spain and Portugal, it seems like flour is the more common output. Um, our friend who also works for Yellowbud Farm, our nursery partner, Dana Maple Feeney, has been in contact with a pretty big uh, processor of acorn flour, a cooperative processor of acorn flour in Portugal, and I think is organizing a visit. I got to see some images and video of their operation, and it seemed like actually a very large percentage of the machinery that they were using was actually Chestnut machines from like Kyankia and other firms that we've discussed here, because many phases of that process are like mechanically very similar. I think the primary area where it's different for acorns is leaching, um, which, for people who aren't familiar, like acorns naturally have tannins in them, which you need to remove with water in order to make it edible. Um, and that is not something you have to do for chestnuts or hazelnuts, ergo, it's not something that the firms we've discussed produce, but it's also mechanically pretty simple. Like it's just literally just submerging them in cold water repeatedly until the tannins are gone. So I don't know exact. I think they might just be plumbing their own system for that, or there might be machines in South Korea that do that. And I think that, at the time that we were actually like getting serious about aggregating and handling and processing and that we needed to have answers to these questions, we would probably consider doing a research trip like the one we just did, focused on Chestnut equipment in Italy, and go see how they're doing it in Portugal and Spain and probably South Korea in that case, because I think South Korea has a lot more specialized equipment. But it actually seemed a lot less daunting when I saw some of the examples of how people were doing it than I would have guessed. Um, for some of the other crops we're talking about, like hickory oil, acorn oil, that's like quite a different set of needs in terms of machines. And a couple of colleagues and friends of ours who are leading some of the kind of germplasm exploration and industry development work on the hickory oil effort have basically figured out like I don't know what you call it, minimally viable way to press it, and are pressing like 30 to 100 gallons using these setups. I think there's definitely, by their self-reported assessment, like a lot of opportunities to improve that. I'm trying to get in contact with some more experienced uh, like nut oil industry professionals who have a lot of experience processing other nuts for oil, to try to see if we can learn from those processes and see which of those processes and machines might apply to hickory. Um, so there's a lot of R&D to do there. Um, I can't remember what the rest of it was. I think I'll stop.
I think you got there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
That question did make me think, Noah, that we should plan to have a webinar later this year, as we're kind of in a little bit of a strategic revisiting process right now that's thinking about how we add in some of the diversity you're referring to, Nadav. So maybe we'll have a webinar where we talk a little bit about how we're starting to add new species to the mix for our business, and kind of what some of the next steps will be on all that. We're very excited about some experimentation on doing having other folks come to the party in terms of sourcing high quality oak genetics from existing park and city trees that we're not ready to commit on a big project yet, but if anyone's interested, you can definitely reach out to us for future involvement in oak fun, because there is kind of a lack of selection within native oaks in the US for productive traits, especially the red oak group. We are at 9:05, so I think we'll probably sign off here. JD, I see you just came off video. Were you intending to ask a question? Should we do one more? Or are you just saying hi?
I was just gonna say thanks. Very informative. Appreciate the time. And yeah, I know we chatted a couple months ago, Russell, but yeah, I've been perennial farming in California, but I just accepted a job with Steve Gabriel at Wellspring Forest Farm in Ithaca. So I'll definitely come down to your neck of the woods for some volunteer days and say hi.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw your email. Sorry, I haven't replied yet, but congrats on
No, the
getting your
newsletter
gig.
came
That's
perfect
great to
timing.
hear.
I was like, when are the volunteer days? And then the newsletter dropped